Today, this is another movement map lesson, but it's focused on these different aspects of the whip effect or the whip swing. And that's the producing a consistent swing path and a consistent point of contact. And doing that using the laws of physics, letting the laws of physics work with you instead of against you. So let's get started on that. So a quick refresher course on the parts of a tennis racket. So we have our handle, we have our throat, and we have our head. Just three parts to the tennis racket, right? Well, no, there's a fourth part, an invisible part, and that's the center of mass of this device. The center of mass is the average mass of the object, and on a tennis racket it's located at the balance point, about 2/3 of the way up before the throat of the racket. This is where you can balance the racket. We'll talk about the importance of this fourth invisible part, the center of mass now. The concept of center of mass is key to understanding how clubs and rackets are designed and how they're built to swing. So each of the major swing sports, here's a driver for golf, has a center of mass. Again, just like the tennis racket, most of the weight in this driver is towards the end here in the club head, right? Just like our racket head. And so the balance point, the average center of mass, is somewhat about 2/3 of the way out from the handle. The baseball bat, very similar. Most of the mass, the weight, is in the barrel of the bat here. So the center of mass is, you can just sort of experiment and feel with it, somewhere around 2/3 right before the head of the barrel is the balance point. And to remind you, most of the weight in a racket is in the head, so the balance point is going to be sort of 2/3 of the way up from the handle. And you might be saying at this point, Kim, so what? How does this really help me become a better tennis player, help me swing better? Let me go a little bit deeper into this whole whip analogy and explain. So let's go back to looking at the bullwhip and sort of exactly how it works and the parts of the bullwhip. So we have the handle, it's like on a tennis racket. We have a thong, it's like the throat of the racket. And then it goes all the way down to this piece here, which is called the fall. This acts as sort of the anchor point that swings around the cracker at the end of the cracking of the whip. So this fall piece is pretty pivotal. So how does our tennis racket compare to the structure of the whip? Well, we have the handles, right? The handle, we have the throat, here's the throat. And this center mass of the tennis racket is like the fall of the whip. And it serves as an anchor point for the rotation of the racket head around the swing circle, which I'll explain. So in the GOAT whip, kinetic whip stroke that we're trying to develop, and the overall form being a rotational form from the inside of the slot around in the circle, coming into contact and then passing through. Well, the center mass of the racket head, when thrown out correctly on this swing circle, basically wants to rotate the racket head through into contact and square the ball automatically. So therefore you don't have to be worrying like we do now if you have a recreation swing with a levering pushing action like this. This is extremely difficult to time, and at high speeds it's, you know, unless you're a pro and you've practiced for years, it's pretty much impossible to do it at high speed. But with a rotational swing in the correct manner, which we'll talk about, this head follows the hand in a pulling action, and then as it turns, the head wants to rotate in and around through on its own. Physics takes over. You don't have to do anything. Let's take a closer look at this concept from inside GOAT Studio. This is a simple diagram to show you how the center of mass of the racket acts as an anchor in the rotational swinging movement. The racket head will want to swing or rotate around this anchor point. So you might be asking yourself, Is this invisible center of mass just hype or a myth? So let me show you these slow motion videos of me throwing a golf club, a baseball bat, and a tennis racket. I'll highlight a few parts of this action in a few moments, but first let's focus on how the golf club, baseball bat, and tennis racket all rotate around their center of mass as they are thrown in the air. Again, the center of mass acts as an anchor, propelling the head of the club, bat, or racket around the arc. In my previous movement map video, I stressed that we should not follow a positions without principle approach, that we had to understand the underlying principles and feels of the movement. We won't discuss this extensively today, but the throwing action is an underlying principle of the swing. And many good golf instructors realize this and have emphasized it in their teaching. As I said, we won't go into detail today, but I did want to highlight a few things. In the throwing action in all three sports, you can see the coil of the body and the arms, as we have discussed in the kinetic whip lessons. In all three sports, you can see the release of the club, bat, or racket from a slotted body position with a side bend of the body to allow the elbow to lead a whipping throw. Take a closer look at the tennis throw alone, and you can see more similarities between the throw and the swing. On the left, you see how the strings are facing down in the take back, just as in the take back of the topspin tennis forehand. And you can see the coil of the body and the arm, just as we showed in our wax off take back. On the right, you can see the racket is thrown from the slot with the side bend of the body, with the strings still facing down, and the racket being thrown up and out on edge. This is all very similar to a goat topspin forehand form, which I'll explain shortly. Finally, you see the entire tennis racket throwing sequence with the wind-up, the release from the slot, the racket head being thrown up and out on edge, and then the rotation around the center mass. Before we go back to the court, let's take a look at a few loops of the Federer and Djokovic topspin forehand that shows this complete windshield wiper movement, throwing the racket head from the slot on edge and keeping it on edge throughout the swing. And as I play these videos through twice, I'll stop the video at the key points of the swing so you can really focus on this throwing on edge windshield wiper movement that continues from the slot into the follow through. This is the new GOAT topspin forehand model that we're trying to build. Now that we're back on court, let me summarize what we saw in the two throwing videos. Me throwing the racket high in the air with it spinning around its center of mass, and then the two great GOAT candidates, Djokovic and Federer, with their topspin shot. So whether I'm throwing the racket, and I'll shoot this from the rear position to the target, whether I'm throwing the racket up in the air like you saw me, or whether I'm hitting our GOAT topspin shot, the actions are very similar, and for good reason. As I said, the throwing action underlies the stroking action on all of our shots, especially topspin and serve. But that's for another day in detail. Today we're just at the high level. So remember, if we're gonna get prepared to have a high level throw or swing, we're gonna need a wind up. We're gonna have to take our arms up and back somehow in the wax off sort of position. And then we're gonna have a hand brake, and then in order to throw up, we have to drop the racket sort of in orientation, right? And then we talked about winding back into the slot. So whether I'm gonna throw it or whether I'm gonna swing it, the actions in the slot look very similar. The racket strings are facing down and the racket is on edge. And the racket tip is pointed toward the side back fence area. Not pointed here generally, it can be, but generally in a full windup, if they have time, the pros are going to take it back somewhat more in this manner. So from here, if I'm going to throw it up into the air to the left up there, I'm going to keep this string down on edge dynamic, which we'll talk about more. And I'm going to unwind this coiled arm in the wrist, a very loose, feeling, whipping, throwing action. And that racket, if I left it go in the air, is going to, as you saw, travel around the center of mass on this arcway. On the swing, very similar, right? We're going to keep the racket strings face down, and in the first part of the swing, as we saw in the video, racket strings remain closed and the racket head is trailing behind my hand, which we'll talk about shortly. So we driving out here to the right with the handle more pointed out towards the net post over here, not towards the incoming ball. This is a big mistake. Players or teachers are always recommending that the student turn the butt of the racket towards the incoming ball. Well, you can see what that does to my racket head. It shoots it out here to the outer arc of the swing path too early. We want this behind us, trailing all the way into the turn of the topspin swing. And then at the turn, again, we're releasing on an edge, but that edge does plane up, obviously, to be more vertical at contact, but not completely vertical. This is another big mistake. Players think that the racket into contact is coming here, and I'll get at my little Balti so I can demonstrate that a little bit better. As I was saying, as we reach the turn, second phase of the swing, we've come from the slot, but now we're at the turn. The racket head is usually dropping behind the hand and the elbow at this point. And then as we start to approach the contact zone, this racket path is going to go, racket head is going to go in a sharply vertical manner, 25 to 35 degrees vertical, right in here. So in order to get both power and spin, compression on the ball, and the spin that we want on the top spin shot, this racket face must be closed to vertical in this manner. Not like this, that's 90 degrees, but 8 or 12% closed. So that as it passes through this vertical path, the ball can compress on the strings and get the spin that you want. Instead, if we have the old way of setting the racket on edge and coming into contact in a much flatter horizontal way, all we can do is hit a flat, soft ball. We try to really hit topspin with that. It really doesn't work. So we have to have a sharply ascending path, and this racket face remains closed in this windshield wiper action that we saw with the GOATs, Djokovic, Federer, and almost all of the ATP pros now have this uniform, not uniform, but a windshield wiper release. The old method, taught in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and some of our best players, emulated this with the racket on edge more, and Serena and Venus has some of this in their game. So the racket would come through in this more swinging gait manner, and then people would be taught to catch the racket out here on edge. And luckily, a lot of them ignored that kind of advice and gradually got a more windshield wiper release, but not all of them. So this is the point in the video where I say technique is often counterintuitive or a counter common sense. And if you're not taught any differently, you'll go with your common sense and eventually you'll develop a poor technique. So for the average player beginning who doesn't have a lot of instruction, it just makes sense to have the racket on a vertical edge like this and not take it back very far, to split their hands and take the racket back, depending on how confident they are. But essentially the racket moves in this manner, maybe a slight bend back here, but not much. But the idea being that this is going to be a linear path to the target. That would be the safest common sense way to hit the ball. This is very much like the beginner thrower, where if you hand a kid a ball and ask them to throw and they don't have any training, they will have a arm-only linear throwing action to the target. Nothing like the sophisticated rotational throwing action that we see in skilled players. So the natural grip for the beginning and recreational player, doesn't have much tutoring, is again this Eastern grip forehand, where the hand and the palm are placed to the side of the racket. Technically, it's this pad, index pad, is placed on the third bevel on the side, and then the hand is formed around it, usually deep in the palm. So why this particular grip, and why does it have such a hold on players? Well, because their whole concept of the swing is a much more flat, horizontal swinging gait action through here, like this. And so naturally, the hand on the racket to the side like this gives you the greatest security and leveraging in this horizontal swing gait action. Of course, in earlier days, it wasn't just the unskilled and recreational players that generally swang like that. In the 70s and 80s, even our best players, the top players in the world, swung essentially like this. And I'll give you John McEnroe's example. No disrespect to John McEnroe. I always rooted for him. Great player, still is. Won 7 Grand Slam single titles and 9 Grand Slam doubles titles. And I'll provide you a link in the notes where you can go check out what I'm saying now. So he had very much a very similar kind of style that I was just explaining, where there wasn't any coil or wind back. It was simply a turning sideways and a break of the hand brake. And he would extend the racket back here and extending down here a little bit with the head, but essentially it would be more or less in this vertical manner. And then without doing any coiling back or winding back into the slot, he would proceed to have a very linear path through the ball. And then when he got to the contact area, you know, he would use basically his arm and shoulder as an attempt to sort of lever this and get additional power and maybe some topspin on it. And you'll see that in the notes section in the clip that I'll recommend. Nothing derogatory about this. This was in the 70s and 80s, and this is generally the way people played. But with the new GOAT style topspin forehand stroke, which came into dominance with the big three in Federer, 2004, 2005, and is just carried on from there. Next generation has carried it even a bit further. We have a need for a completely different kind of grip. And so 80 to 90% of all professional players now use a semi-Western or Western grip. So in that grip, and again, we should be doing it in our fingers, the pad of this index finger is placed on the 4th bevel down here, down and below the handle, or on the 5th bevel, way below the handle like this. Now in golf, they call this a strong grip. Strong because it kind of gives you the leverage that you need in the kind of swing that you want. And I'll explain that in a moment. But Ben Hogan, who I've said is a candidate for greatest ball striker of all time in golf, said that in terms of grip, that these two fingers are swing killers. And what he meant was exactly what I've been preaching against, is so that if you grab the racket where you have a strong connection like an Eastern forehand grip and the index and thumb are anchored in there, then that gives you a powerful horizontal swinging gait levering action, which is, that is your conception of the swing. That's what you're going to favor. But for the topspin swing, we need, again, something else, which I'll show you. So with the modern GOAT topspin forehand shot, we want the grip to make this more efficient to be in the fingers. We want it to be in a strong grip on the below the handle, in the fourth or fifth bevel, doesn't matter too much. And so why do we have that is because, just as Hogan would recommend, it changes the dominant pressure on the handle to these bottom three fingers, and that you can actually take these two swing killer fingers off the racket and really without much detrimental effect. So with this grip in the fingers of the bottom three fingers of your hand, then this release action, this windshield wiper whipping action, throwing action, is just so much more fluid and easy to achieve. You can maintain the strings face down throughout the swing, and then you can have the gradual coming up here high in the sharply vertical way as the handle, as it turns, pulls up and back around. This accelerates the racket head through in this great whipping motion. And I've seen a lot of instruction where it says, oh, you know, don't do that. You don't have any power with this kind of windshield wiper contact release. Well, it should be obvious by now, given all the pros and all the GOATs, that that isn't true. Is that you still have plenty of stability and security with these three fingers because it's still pressed up into your hand as you come into contact. And as this elbow extends forward, you get both the forward press into the ball on the strings just for a split second, and the vertical lift at the same time. Ball's on the string at only less than 5 milliseconds, 5,000ths of a second. So there is no time and no purpose to thinking that you can extend the racket to the target through contact or prolong this moment. In fact, any attempt to direct your hand in this motion is going to only dramatically slow down your swing, because now, just as in Macro's case, if the racket head and arm are aligned and now you're swinging this through, no matter how fast you do, your hand is only going and your head of your racket is only going less than 20 miles an hour. There's absolutely no whip to it. It's just a pushing, levering action. So to get the modern whip throw, much easier to use the Western and semi-Western strong grip. Now people will say, well, Kim, but Federer's one of your GOAT candidates for topspin. And that's true. He has one of the greatest topspin forehands of all time, right? And he had an Eastern grip. So how does that work? Well, we can't get into the detail now, but Federer did have a way to close down this racket face, and you can see this sort of shoulder rolling action here in contact. I believe that's also part of the reason why his orientation was out here to the right so much and so dramatically, because he really needed that extra focus to keep this in control and not go into this horizontal swinging action. But oftentimes he too would lose control of that technique, and sometimes his forehand would go off dramatically, as in the 2019 Wimbledon final best of 5 that he lost to Djokovic in 3 tie breaks. Well, the last time they played in a Grand Slam final. In those 3 tie-break sets, Djokovic had 0 unforced errors and Federer had 11, most of them being topspin forehand errors. And that's very anecdotal, doesn't prove the case of much of anything, but I'm saying that this idea of the swing path, the grip, you know, can make a huge difference at the high level, medium level, and a low level. So I hope you will take this into account as we proceed. Let's take a step back from the discussion of grips and move on to the second part of the kinetic whip consistency and swing plane issues regarding the center of mass of the racket. So the interesting thing about the center of mass of the racket is that in a pulling action, this center of mass wants to keep the hand or the racket head behind the pulling action of the hand. Wherever the hand goes, the racket head will follow. So from the slot, as we've seen in the videos, and in this rotational stroke, the first phase of the topspin release is more with the racket traveling out here to the right, where the racket head is not that much far below the hand. So it's more of a driving out to the right action, and we're really trying to resist the idea of opening up too soon and throwing this racket head out on the arc circle too soon. So this is why the center of mass is so important, is that if we want to preserve our form, preserve our whip, preserve the power of our throws, you know, we want a pulling action. And we want to drive out here, and as we get to the second phase of the topspin forehand, which is the turn, where we're going to go into the sharply rising vertical path of the swing through contact, we still want the racket head to be traveling and lagging behind the hand as long as possible. When we reach contact, still the hand is ahead of the racket head. The racket head is behind and below the hand, but in this kind of path that way. So why does the racket start to move out on this arcing path? Why doesn't it just stay back, sort of back here? Well, it's because of the turn of the body and the rotation. This is going to, through centripetal force, throw the racket head out on the circle. But we want to let that happen in a natural whipping manner. What we don't want in the old style is, and what I said about Coco and whatnot, is to have this racket head extend out too soon here. Lost everything. We've lost the coil, lost the power. And now we're going to have a arm-only steering action and a levering, trying to manipulate contact sort of way of hitting, which again at high speed is virtually impossible. Again, it can work at low speeds and it can work against other opponents who don't hit any better, but not in the modern game. So with this racket extending out as our arms extend out, flowing, the rotational energy from the core of our body is actually flowing through the racket, through the center of mass, holding it back till it can't hold it back any longer, and then it whips through. You know, it's a release of that pent up coil and energy of the arm and our throwing action. I have a little diagram that I'll show in the background of this video. Will reduce my size of my video, that shows the idea of a mass, center of mass being pulled smoothly behind it. You can see this phenomenon all the time in a car and a trailer. So again, if the car is the handle and the trailer is the head, that as this car maneuvers and goes, this head will want to follow it. If it's on an arc like this, it'll follow smoothly around. It won't jump up or lay back. It will try to track it. And that's what we want with a pulling action using the center of a mass to keep the racket lagging behind on the smooth track that we're going to produce with our topspin shot. I said at the beginning of this lesson, movement map, that we wanted the laws of physics to work with us, not against us. And so the third element, or third law of physics that's helping us with this topspin swing is the manner in which we're throwing this racket on edge through the air. And again, I'll post a picture in the background to shake me up to show you an airplane taking off. So when we throw the racket out on edge, much like we would throw a frisbee if we were throwing it high, the release would be something like this. We wouldn't throw it flat, it would just dive into the ground. We want this upward vector and use the airfoil of the frisbee to keep it in the air. Well, a similar thing happens if we throw it on edge, is that the air pressure is different on either side of this bevel here at this airfoil at the top. And it gives the racket more lift and stability, just like it does an airplane. And it's maybe not huge, but it's pretty substantial, considering that we were trying to throw this at 80 miles an hour around this circle. Any wobble, any deviation in this path is going to result in an error. So how do we possibly swing this at 80 miles an hour and make contact so perfectly? Almost every time if you're a goat. Well, not every time, but close to every time. So these laws of physics, again, if we throw this on edge, I can even feel sort of the racket sort of give a little bit of a rise as I come around and through. And the racket does stabilize in its path. And so our chances of making good contact are that much more increased. So we're getting to the end of this movement map lesson. Remember, this is the overview lesson. Deliberate practice lessons will follow. The first is that the topspin forehand is a system of different parts and components and laws of physics. Highly integrated, highly efficient to produce power and spin on a topspin shot. So all these different parts with the grip, the angles of which we throw things, and how we deliver the racket, all are integrated into this overall conception of the topspin forehand. So don't get overwhelmed with all the parts and pieces too much. Keep the big picture in mind.